This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 709 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the transactions this week, I want to remind you that FanDuel and GMC are back to bring you the GMC Sierra Mountain Climber Pick'em, a free-to-play contest series that gives you a chance to win a share of $10,000 in FanDuel site credit every Sunday, courtesy of GMC. Here's how it works. Every Sunday during the NFL season, you'll have a chance to answer questions based on the day's 1 p.m. and 4:25 p.m. games. The more questions you answer correctly, the higher up the mountain you'll move. If during any week you answer every question correctly for a perfect score, you'll reach the summit and win your share of $10,000 in site credit. The contest series is now live, so head to fanduel.com/free/contest/GMC to start climbing the mountain. Add Christian Watson. Now look, there were a lot of red flags to Christian Watson's prospect profile, at least from a numbers-driven perspective. Usually, early declare wide receivers, they're the ones that you want. Christian Watson, not an early declare. We usually see wide receivers from bigger programs have more success at the NFL level. Watson went to a smaller collegiate program. And successful pro wide receivers, they usually have good production profiles. Watson's was fine, but it wasn't amazing. So you're probably wondering, why did Christian Watson go in the second round of the NFL draft? And the answer to that question is that he has freakish size and he's an insane athlete. And as I've said on this show during the offseason and even in the season, sometimes that athleticism, it translates. It translated in week 10. Watson had his big game. He had his big breakout game. He found the end zone 3 times. He had 32.7 PPR points. I don't think this was some fluke. He played 85% of the team's snaps. He had a 42% target share in that game. He's just the 11th wide receiver this year to hit a 40% target share. And let me tell you guys, the list of players who have hit that mark, it's very, very good. So you're probably sitting there wondering, how aggressive should you be in getting Christian Watson off the waiver wire? And my answer to that is, you should be quite aggressive. Now this is going to sound like a back-patting moment, and it inherently kind of is. It inherently is kind of a victory lap. A handful of weeks ago on this show, on a mailbag episode, I got a question about which rookie wide receiver could be this year's Amon-Ra St. Brown. A first-year wide receiver who comes out of nowhere and gives us a league-winning stretch during the fantasy playoffs. Who could be that guy? One of my picks was Christian Watson. Because if he got healthy, and if that athleticism translated, then he'd have an opportunity to see a nice share of this Packers offense. Because this Packers offense doesn't have a lot of good locked-in wide receivers. And again, I'm not bringing this up to just pat myself on the back. I'm bringing this up to say that this was not totally unpredictable. The high-end outcome, we're not predicting that, but we're playing probability. We're trying to set ourselves up to have these players on our roster. I think this is one of those scenarios where, no, I'm not sitting here predicting Christian Watson's going to score 33 PPR points. But just because you can't predict that doesn't mean that you can't predict something good. It doesn't mean that you can't predict a good outcome for one of these players. You just have to be ahead of the market. And with Christian Watson, I was ahead of the market. And I think that he is someone that you need on your fantasy roster moving forward. The Packers have a pretty average schedule in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers moving forward. But you can't just sit back and wait and see what happens with Christian Watson. You have to get him this week, and you have to spend up to get him, period. This does not happen very often throughout a fantasy football season. And he's probably not going to post those same numbers again this year. But if he's healthy, he's going to see good usage in this offense more than likely. He's an uber athlete seeing a lot of looks in an Aaron Rodgers-led offense. Sign me up. Sell D'Onta Foreman. So we'll go from one good prediction that I had with Christian Watson to a bad one. There's no reason to run away from my takes. I feel okay with saying that I was ahead with Christian Watson because I'm going to be honest and say that I was not with D'Onta Foreman. Because a couple of weeks ago, I sat here on this show and said that Foreman was a sell candidate. Now that looked okay after his 4-point performance against the Bengals in week 9. But then he crushed the Falcons in week 10. He had 31 carries in that game for 130 yards and a touchdown. He's now rushed for 118 plus yards on the ground in 3 of his 4 games played without Christian McCaffrey. He's looking like a very legitimate option moving forward. Now, with that being said, I'm not sitting here doubling down on a bad take. I'm resetting. Where we're at right now with D'Onta Foreman, if I would have never said to sell him earlier in the season, I would still be saying to sell him right now because this is the process. We can't and we shouldn't ignore the fact that his two biggest performances this year came against Atlanta, arguably the worst defense in football. The Falcons aren't on the Panthers' schedule anymore. And speaking of that schedule, from now through the end of the year, the Panthers running backs will face the third hardest schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed. And they still have their bye. That's another reason that you might want to trade away D'Onta Foreman. But out of their remaining 6 matchups, only 2 of them are considered decent ones. And Foreman's not seeing a ton of work through the air. He's averaging about a 7% target share per game since that CMC trade. He's averaging 1 reception per game. Now, like I said, this is a reset. D'Onta Foreman will be usable moving forward. I'm just bringing this up this week because the Panthers aren't a good football team, objectively. They won't necessarily be able to consistently hit these game scripts that they've hit against Atlanta this year. So if you can sell Foreman high, I think it makes sense. But yes, I'm sitting here and I'm saying I was ahead with Christian Watson. I'm taking the L with D'Onta Foreman. That's how it goes as a fantasy analyst. Buy Amari Cooper. So Amari Cooper had one of his worst outings of the season on Sunday. He caught all 3 of his targets for just 32 yards. His 9.1% target share was his lowest of the season. But I do think that better days are ahead for Cooper. He's really been one of the best under-the-radar wide receivers all season long. He entered the week with almost a 28% target share per game. And he's soon going to get Deshaun Watson back. And he's going to get Deshaun Watson during the most important part of the fantasy football season. And not only that, but Cleveland's got pretty good wide receiver matchups in weeks 16 and 17. They get the Saints and the Commanders. I talked about Donovan Peoples-Jones last week as an ad. That still holds true. Just don't forget about Amari Cooper, too. Add and sell Cole Kmet. Across Cole Kmet's first 8 games, he had about 36 PPR points. Over his last 2, he's scored over 45. And clearly, given what I just said with this transaction, I'm not buying it. There's nothing wrong with adding Cole Kmet off the waiver wire this week. You should probably be doing that. This is more about expectations moving forward, though. The Bears are averaging 20 team targets per game. That means that in order for Kmet to even see 5 targets in a game, he'll need to hold a 25% target share in Chicago's offense. Can we really bank on that? He's only hit that mark in 1 game this year, which happened in week 10. He had almost 39% of the team's targets this past week. Now, he did hit a 22% target share the week prior, so things are trending up. But is this really sustainable? The Bears are coming off 2 games against teams that have been pretty bad against tight ends this year. They've been bottom 5 teams in adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. In other words, they've been good matchups for Cole Kmet. Moving forward, it's not nearly as clean. According to those same adjusted fantasy points allowed numbers, Chicago's schedule through the end of the fantasy season, completely average. And funny enough, they've had the second best tight end schedule through 10 weeks. Now, Kmet's performances may lead to more involvement just naturally within this offense. But it's a bad system for pass catchers. They're running the ball so much. So in turn, a player like Kmet or any pass catcher on this team, they need to be uber efficient in order to be fantasy relevant. There's no way that Cole Kmet continues this touchdown streak. He scored 4 times on 9 receptions over the last 2 weeks. So you can absolutely add him this week. But it wouldn't be that bad of an idea to try to find a trade partner then. Hold DeAndre Swift. So you might be thinking, oh, awesome, DeAndre Swift finally scored a touchdown. I can finally sell him high now. It doesn't really work that way. Fantasy managers know that DeAndre Swift is a headache. Thanks to that injury and the Lions just playing it safe, Swift hasn't hit a 30% running back rush share since week 1. His target shares have been consistent. He's seen a double-digit percentage target share in each of his last 5 games. But he's not a bell cow back, not even close. And even with that touchdown on Sunday, he scored just 8.2 PPR points. You can't trade him away. The talent profile is there, and there's a chance that the Lions continue to ramp up his snap share. That's what they did in week 10, technically. His snap rate in week 9 was 16%. That jumped to 30.5% in week 10. So he was seeing more snaps against the Bears than he did the previous week. And if you want to look at this more optimistically, Detroit's rest of season schedule is a top 5 one for running backs in adjusted fantasy points allowed. They get matchups against the Panthers and the Bears in week 16 and 17. So I think that if you have DeAndre Swift, You have to just hope that the Lions use him a little bit more. Add Kadarius Toney. So at this time, you can find Kadarius Toney on about half of Yahoo waiver wires. But let's look at the facts first. Toney has seen target shares of just 3% and 14% in his 2 games with the Chiefs. And he had snap shares of 8% and 45%. Those aren't great numbers at all. And as we know, this past week, Juju Smith-Schuster, he had a concussion, and Mecole Hardman was out. Toney's usage so far has not been good, objectively. But that was to be expected. He's learning a new system, and he's a pretty raw wide receiver. The hope here is that he can keep carving out a larger and larger role in this offense. And he's been pretty ridiculous per touch. Just to give you some perspective, Mecole Hardman leads 30-plus target receivers this year in PPR points per target. He's at 2.76. Toney right now, across his 2 games, it's a small sample size, but he's at 3.17. So you should add Kadarius Toney and hope that he can see more and more work in this offense. Add or buy Rachaad White. Rachaad White's currently available in 55% of Yahoo leagues. I have no idea how. I feel like I've talked about him like 18 times on this show this season, but you should be adding him this week. White ended up playing a season-high 65% snap share against the Seahawks on Sunday. Yes, I know, Leonard Fournette missed some time because of injury. But White got the start in that game, and he was seeing just as much usage up until that injury occurred. He finished the day with a 58% running back rush share. That was the highest of his season. Now, the Bucs have a bye this week, and Adam Schefter already reported that Fournette's expected to be back in Week 12. And maybe he will be. That report is one reason why you could actually buy Rachaad White even lower right now. And I do think that White is a buy. He's been trending the right way for weeks now. From weeks 1 to 3, he averaged a running back rush share per game of just 10%. Over his last 4 games, that number's been over 43%. He's seeing a lot more work now than he was at the beginning of the season. And this isn't to say that Uncle Lenny's going to go away. But if this does move to a fully split backfield, White is the guy who's going to be cheaper. It's going to be a lot easier to get Rachaad White than Leonard Fournette. And moving forward, after their Week 11 bye, the Buccaneers have an awesome schedule for running backs. In the fantasy playoffs in Week 16 and 17, they get the Cardinals and the Panthers. Those are 2 teams that rank as top 10 favorable matchups to running backs in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So you have some things working in Rachaad White's favor right now, and things working in your favor if you want to trade for him. They have a bye this week. Usually it's a lot easier to trade for players who are on bye. The report is out there saying that Leonard Fournette is okay, but we don't know that for sure. Who knows what's going to happen next week? So I think right now is the time to buy into Rachaad White in case this backfield continues to be a split backfield, because those playoff matchups are very, very good. Add Jarvis Landry. So we haven't seen Jarvis Landry on a football field since Week 4 before his return in Week 10 against Pittsburgh. And in that game against the Steelers, he only scored 6.7 PPR points, but he had a 21% target share. He played the most snaps at wide receiver on the team. So without Michael Thomas, I think that Jarvis Landry could get some run down the stretch. He could be a decent enough fantasy asset. So go ahead and add him this week. Sell Josh Jacobs. One of the biggest surprises without a doubt of the 2022 fantasy season has been Josh Jacobs. He's been a complete bell cow for the Raiders since Week 2. Now, he had a couple of non-elite performances in Week 8 and Week 9, but he bounced back this past week against the Colts. He had almost 23 PPR points, and his target share was 21%. That was the highest of his season. So from a usage standpoint, there is absolutely nothing wrong with Josh Jacobs. This is more of a call out about the Raiders' schedule in the fantasy playoffs. In Week 15, they get New England. New England ranks as the toughest matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs this year. The next week, they get Pittsburgh. The Steelers are the 7th toughest. Then in the fantasy championship, it's San Francisco. They're the 2nd hardest matchup. So if you're able to flip Jacobs for a player in a similar tier, a high-end one, he's still an elite fantasy asset. But now might be the time to do it. You really should not have to sell low in order to make this transaction happen. Josh Jacobs is a very, very good fantasy asset. It's just that if you're looking towards the playoffs, he could see a little bit worse production. Add Nico Collins. So similar to Jarvis Landry, Nico Collins is someone who's seeing good volume within a not-so-great offense. He's actually hit a 25% target share in 2 of his last 3 games. He scored double-digit PPR points in 3 of his last 4. And here's something that I don't think a lot of people know. Nico Collins has actually averaged more receiving yards per game this year than teammate Brandon Cooks. So if your league is rostering Brandon Cooks right now, you should probably roster Nico Collins too. Add Treylon Burks. So Treylon Burks returned from his injury in week 10, and while his end-of-game stats weren't anything great, anything to write home about, his peripherals were not that bad. He played behind Robert Woods and Nick Westbrook-Akine in snaps against Denver, but he ran just as many routes as Westbrook-Akine did. He ended up seeing a 17% target share. In healthy games this year, he's averaging a target share per game rate of 18.6%. Now, it's tough to go all in on a Tennessee Titans wide receiver. It's a run-heavy scheme. It's not very attractive for fantasy football. But Burks is a talented wide receiver. He should be on more rosters than he's currently on. Buy Deontay Johnson. So I talked up George Pickens last week on this 15 transaction show. He had a decent fantasy day. It seems logical to now pivot to Deontay Johnson. It's been a really rough year for Johnson. He's seeing a 26% target share in Pittsburgh's offense, but he's scored just 10.5 PPR points per game. And that's mainly because he still hasn't found the end zone despite recording 435 receiving yards. That's the second highest total from a wide receiver without a touchdown. And first is Donovan Peoples-Jones. Even in a bad offense, Johnson should have more than 0 touchdowns. Touchdown regression is coming. And the Steelers, as I mentioned with Pickens last week, they have a really great rest of season schedule for wide receivers. It's a top 5 schedule when looking at it through the lens of adjusted fantasy points allowed. I would bet that you can send some bench assets to get Deontay Johnson right now. Add Paris Campbell. Weeks 8 and 9 were not very friendly for Paris Campbell. He averaged a 13% target share per game, and he scored just a little over 6 PPR points per game. But as you know, those games were started by Sam Ehlinger. In Campbell's last 3 games with Matt Ryan under center, that target share rate has been 27.4%. His PPR points per game average is almost 21. This switch to Matt Ryan is really, really big for Colts pass catchers, but it's arguably biggest for Paris Campbell. Add Foster Moreau. So the Raiders don't have Darren Waller, they don't have Hunter Renfrow. That's going to allow Foster Moreau to have steady usage in this offense. He ran the 3rd most routes on the team in week 10. He trailed Devontae Adams with just 2 routes run. His 10.5% target share was nothing great, but he's actually had a double-digit percentage target share in every single game played since week 2. And he's averaged a target share per game of about 17% over his last 4. That's not bad for a tight end. He'll likely be a high floor, low ceiling option most weeks. But at tight end, that's sometimes good enough. Add the Cincinnati Bengals defense. So the Bengals are available in a lot of leagues right now because they had a bye in week 10. This week, they get Pittsburgh. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, the Bengals are 4.5-point road favorites, and the game's early over-under is 40.5 points. Pittsburgh's the 7th best matchup for opposing defenses in adjusted fantasy points allowed. They've allowed a top 10 defensive performance in 6 of their last 7 games. So that makes the Bengals a pretty obvious streaming choice. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out lateround.com. Otherwise, I will talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trend Show.